Bingo, bango, bongo. We are live. Hey, crew, it's Pitt. Welcome back. We are going to be trying something new. I'm trying to get these lives in, and this seems to be a good way to do it. We're going to do the PittCast here where I'm doing the readings, and if people drop in, we can stop and talk about it. So, we're going to be reading through today with the Federalist Papers. We are starting at 4 because we have already done 1 through 3. It's available from yesterday, it is already up. The Federalist Papers are the reasoning behind ratifying the Constitution. This is the argument for the union that we currently have, as opposed to a loose association or confederation of states, which was one of the arguments that was being made, which is one of the arguments being made today. We have people today arguing for a peaceful dissolution. Well, dissolution will not be peaceful. If it happens, it will be at the cost of arms, and that is not what we want. We are indeed stronger together. We don't always have to agree. That is the point of having states. So that if you don't agree with what your state is doing, there's another one that you can find where you can find someone that agrees with you. We're going to be continuing to read from the Federalist Papers. This is Federalist number 4. It is authored by John Jay. It is for the Independent Journal to the people of the state of New York. My last paper assigned several reasons why the safety of the people would be best secured by union against the danger it may be exposed to by just causes of war given to other nations. And those reasons shows that such just that such causes would not only be more rarely given, but would also be more easily accommodated by a national government than by either state governments or the proposed little confederacies. But the safety of the people of America against dangers from foreign force depends not only on their forbearing to give just causes of war to other nations, but also on their placing and continuing themselves in such a situation as to not invite in hostility or insult. For it need to be observed that there are pretended as well as just causes for war. It is too true, however disgraceful it may be to human nature, that nations in general will make war whenever they have a prospect of getting anything by it. Nay, absolute monarchs will often make war when their nations get nothing by it. But for the purposes and objects merely personal, such as thirst for military glory, revenge for personal affronts, ambition, or private compacts, to aggrandize or support their particular families or partisans. These, and a variety of other motives, which affect only the mind of the sovereign, often lead him to engage in wars not sanctified by justice or the voice and interest of his people, but independent of those inducements to war, which are more prevalent in absolute monarchies, but which well deserve our attention. There are others which affect nations as often as kings, and some of them will, on examination, be found to grow out of our relative situation and circumstances. With France and Britain, we are rivals in fisheries and can supply their markets cheaper than they can themselves, notwithstanding any efforts to prevent it by bounties on our own or duties on foreign fish. With them and with most other European nations, we are rivals in navigation and the carrying trade, and we shall deceive ourselves if we suppose that any of them will rejoice to see it flourish. For as our carrying trade cannot increase without some degree diminishing theirs, it is more in their interest, and will be more their policy, to restrain than to promote it. In the trade to China and India, we interfere with more than one nation, inasmuch as it enables us to partake in advantages which they had in a manner monopolized, and as we thereby supply ourselves with commodities which we use to purchase from them. The extension of our own commerce in our own vessels cannot give pleasure to any nations whose possess territories on or near this continent, because the cheapness and excellence of our productions, added to the circumstance of the vicinity, and the enterprise and address of our merchants and navigators, will give us a greater share in the advantages which those territories afford than consist with the wishes or policy of their respective sovereigns. Spain thinks it convenient to shut the Mississippi against us on one side, and Britain excludes us from the St. Lawrence on the other. Nor will either of them permit the other waters which are between them and us to become the means of mutual intercourse and traffic. From these and such like considerations, which might, if consistent with prudence, be more amplified and detailed, it is easy to see that jealousies and uneasiness may gradually slide into the minds and cabinets of other nations, and that we are not to expect that they should regard our advancement in union, in power and consequence, by land and by sea, with an eye of indifference and composure. The people of America are aware that inducements to war may arise out of these circumstances, as well as from others not so obvious at present, and that whenever such inducements may find fit time and opportunity for operation, pretenses to color or justify them will not be wanting. Wisely, therefore, do they consider union and a good national government as necessary to put and keep them in such a situation as, instead of inviting war, will tend to repress and discourage it. That situation consists in the best possible state of defense and necessarily depends on the government, the arms, and the resources of the country. As the safety of the whole is the interest of the whole and cannot be provided for without government, either one or more or many, let us inquire whether one good government is not, relative to the object in question, more competent than any other given number whatever. One government can collect and avail itself of all the talents and experience of the ablest men in whatever part of the Union they may be found. It can move on uniform principles of policy. It can harmonize, assimilate, and protect several parts and members, and extend the benefit of foresight and precautions to each. In the formation of treaties, it will regard the interest of the whole, and the particular interest of the parts is connected with that of the whole. It can apply the resources and power of the whole to the defense of any particular part, and that more easily and expeditiously than state governments or separate confederacies can possibly do, for want of concert and unity of system. It can place the militia under one plan of discipline, and by putting their officers in a proper line of subordination to the chief magistrate, will, as it were, consolidate them into one corps, and thereby render them more efficient than if divided into 13 or into 3 or 4 distinct independent companies. What would the militia of Britain be if the English militia obeyed the government of England, if the Scotch militia obeyed the government of Scotland, and if the Welsh militia obeyed the government of Wales? Suppose an invasion. Would those 3 governments, if they agreed at all, be able with their respective forces to operate against the enemy so effectually as the single government of Great Britain would? We have heard much of the fleets of Britain, and the time may come, if we are wise, when the fleets of America may engage attention. But if one national government had not so regulated the navigation of Britain as to make it a nursery for seamen, if one national government had not called forth all the national means and materials for forming fleets, their prowess and their thunder would never have been celebrated. Let England have its navigation and fleet. Let those 4 of the constituent parts of the British Empire be under 4 independent governments, and it is easy to perceive how soon they would each dwindle into comparative insignificance. Apply these facts to our own case. Leave America divided into 13, or, if you please, into 3 or 4 independent governments. What armies could they raise and pay? What fleets could they ever hope to have? If one was attacked, would the others fly to its succor and spend their money into blood and money in its defense? Would there be no danger of their being flattered into neutrality by its specious promises, or seduced by too great a fondness for peace to decline hazarding their tranquility and present safety for the sake of neighbors? of whom perhaps they have been jealous, and whose importance they are content to see diminished. Although such conduct would not be wise, it would nevertheless be natural. The history of the states of Greece and of other countries abounds with such instances. And is it not improbable that what has so often happened would, under similar circumstances, happen again? But admit that they might be willing to help the invaded state or confederacy. How and when? And in what proportion shall aids of men and money be afforded? Who shall command the allied armies? And from which of them shall he receive his orders? Who shall settle the terms of peace? And in the case of disputes, what umpire shall decide between them and compel acquiescence? Various difficulties and inconveniences would be inseparable from such a situation, whereas one government, watching over the general and common interest, and combining and directing the powers and resources of the whole, would be free from all of these embarrassments and conduce a far more to the safety of the people. But whatever may be our situation, whether firmly united under one national government or split into a number of confederacies, certain it is that foreign nations will know and view it exactly as it is, and they will act towards us accordingly. If they see that our national government is efficient and well administered, our trade prudently regulated, our military, our militia properly organized and disciplined, our resources and finances discreetly managed, our credit reestablished, our people free, contented, and united, they will be much more disposed to cultivate our friendship than provoke our resentment. If, on the other hand, they find us either destitute of an effectual government, each state doing right or wrong as its rulers may seem convenient, or split into three or four independent and probably discordant republics or confederacies, one inclining to Britain and another to France and a third to Spain, and perhaps played off against each other by the other three. What a poor, pitiful figure will America make in their eyes! How liable would she become not only to their contempt, but to their outrage? And how soon would dear bought experience proclaim that when a people or a family so divide, it never fails to be against themselves? And so we do have a very good argument for why we need to remain a union. These are all still very relevant today. Do you think that China would not take exception if we became weaker? Like we are currently weaker. We have like this last paragraph, right? We're living the problem outlined right here. If they see that our national government is efficient and well administered and our trade prudently regulated, the militia properly organized and disciplined, our resources and finances discreetly managed, and our credit reestablished, our people free, contented, and united, they will be more disposed to cultivate our friendship. But if, on the other hand, they find us either destitute of an effectual government, each state doing right or wrong, as to its rulers may seem convenient, or split into three or four independent and probably discordant republics or confederacies. Now, there are people who are very much pushing for Texas to secede, to California to break apart, to having national divorce. And that is a remarkably not intelligent idea. What we need to do is take the responsibility for ourselves that are outlined in these papers. We need to be ensuring that the highest goals of freedom and liberty are actually held, that we actually have an effectual government. We don't. What we have currently is quite ineffectual. Now, part of that is part of the system. We are intended to have a slow moving government. It's fast enough to react to danger, but slow enough to not change too fast. Our Congress is specifically structured to be the will of the people in whole, so that we have a voice in whole for our people. And the Senate is supposed to be a more measured way of counterbalancing the mob rule of the democracy. The system that we have is the only one that enables freedom in the slightest. It is the we have the only freedom on the planet. Like, and if you don't believe that, go to England and say the wrong thing. Now, there are absolutely examples of that here too, but it is not policy. It is a travesty when it happens here. It's policy over there. Oh, what we need is to be united. We need to have common goals. We need to have a common purpose. I think that this moon train thing may be exactly what we need, even though some people find that a little bit silly. All right, so now we're going to do the Federalist 5, and let's see what we got. This is for the Independent Journal by John Jay to the people of the state of New York. Queen Anne, in her letter of the 1st July, 1706 to the Scotch Parliament, makes some observations on the importance of the union then forming between England and Scotland, which merit our attention. I shall present the public with one or two extracts from it. An entire and perfect union will be the solid foundation of lasting peace. It will secure your religion, liberty, and property. Remove the animosities amongst yourselves and the jealousies and differences betwixt the two kingdoms. It must increase your strength, riches, and trade. And by this union, the whole island, being joined in affection and free from all apprehensions of different interests, will be enabled to resist all its enemies. We most earnestly recommend to you calmness and unanimity in this great and weighty affair, that the union may be brought to a happy conclusion, being the only effectual way to secure and our present and future happiness, and disappoint the designs of our and your enemies, who will, doubtless, on this occasion, use their utmost endeavors to prevent or delay this union. It was remarked in the preceding paper that weakness and divisions at home would invite dangers from abroad, and that nothing would tend more to secure us from them than union, strength, and good government within ourselves. This subject is copious and cannot be easily exhausted. A history of Great Britain is the one with which we are in general the best acquainted, and it gives us many useful lessons. We may profit by their experience without paying the price which it cost them. Although it seems obvious to common sense that the people of such an island would be but one nation, yet we find that they were for ages divided into three, and that those three were almost constantly embroiled in quarrels and wars with one another, notwithstanding their true interest with respect to the continental nations was really the same. Yet, by the arts and policy and practices of those nations, their mutual jealousies were perpetually kept inflamed, and for a long series of years they were far more inconvenient and troublesome than they were useful in assisting to each other. Should the people of America divide themselves into 3 or 4 nations, would not the same thing happen? Would not similar jealousies arise and be in like manner cherished? Instead of their being joined in affection and free from all apprehension of different interests, envy and jealousy would soon extinguish confidence and affection, and the partial interests of each confederacy, instead of the general interest of all America, would be the only subjects of their policy and pursuits. Hence, like most other bordering nations, they would always be either involved in disputes and war or live in the constant apprehension of them. The most sanguine advocates for 3 or 4 confederacies cannot reasonably suppose that they would long remain exactly on an equal footing in point of strength, even if it was possible to form them so at first. But admitting that to be practicable, yet what human contrivance can secure the continuance of such equality, independent of those local circumstances which tend to beget an increased power in one part to impede its progress in another? We must advert to the effects of that superior policy and good management, which would probably distinguish the government of one above the rest, and by which their relative equality in strength and consideration would be destroyed. For it cannot be presumed that the same degree of sound policy, prudence, and foresight would uniformly be observed by each of these confederacies for a long succession of years. Whenever and from whatever causes it might happen, and happen it would, that any of these nations or confederacies should rise on the scale of political importance much above the degree of her neighbors. That moment would those neighbors behold her with envy and with fear. Both those passions would lead them to countenance, if not to promote, whatever might promise to diminish her importance, and would also restrain them from measures calculated to advance or even to secure her prosperity. Much time would not be necessary to enable her to discern these unfriendly dispositions. She would soon begin not only to lose confidence in her neighbors, but also to feel a disposition equally unfavorable to them. Distrust naturally creates distrust, and by nothing is goodwill and kind conduct more speedily changed than by invidious jealousies and uncated imputations, whether express or implied. The North is generally the region of strength, and many local circumstances render it probable that most northern of the proposed confederacies would, at a period not very distant, be unquestionably more formidable than any of the others. No sooner would this become evident than the northern hive would excite the same ideas and sensations in the more southern parts of America, which it formerly did in the southern parts of Europe. Nor does it appear to be a rash conjecture that its young swarms might often be tempted to gather honey in the more blooming fields and milder area of their luxurious and more delicate neighbors. They who well consider the history of similar divisions and confederacies will find abundant reason to apprehend that those in contemplation would in no other sense be neighbors than they would be borderers, that they would neither love nor trust one another, but, on the contrary, would be prey to discord, jealousy, and mutual injuries. In short, they would place us exactly in the situations in which some nations doubtless wish to see us, viz., formidable only to each other. From these considerations, it appears that those gentlemen were greatly mistaken who supposed that alliances, offensive and defensive, might be formed between these confederacies, and would produce that combination and union of arms and of wills of arms and resources, which would be necessary to put and keep them in a formidable state of defense against foreign enemies. When did the independent states, into which Britain and Spain were formerly divided, combine in such alliance or unite their forces against a foreign enemy? The proposed confederacies will be distinct nations. Each of them would have its own commerce with foreigners to regulate by distinct treaties. And as their productions and commodities are different and proper for different markets, so would those treaties be essentially different. Different commercial concerns must create different interests, and of course, different degrees of political attachment to and connection with foreign nations. Hence, it might and probably would happen that the foreign nation with whom the Southern Confederacy might be at war would be the one with whom the Northern Confederacy would be the most desirous of preserving peace and friendship. An alliance so contrary to their immediate interest would not therefore be easy to form, nor, if formed, would it be observed and fulfilled with perfect good faith. Nay, it is far more probable that in America, as in Europe, neighboring nations, acting under the impulse of opposite interest and unfriendly passions, would frequently be found taking different sides. Considering our distance from Europe, it would be more natural for these confederacies to apprehend danger from one another than from distant nations, and therefore that each of them should be more desirous to guard against the others by the aid of foreign alliances than to guard against our foreign dangers by alliances between themselves. And here, let us not forget how much more easy it is to receive foreign fleets into our ports and foreign armies into our country than it is to persuade or compel them to depart. How many conquests did the Romans and others make in the characters of allies? And what innovations did they, under the same character, introduce into the governments of those whom they pretended to protect? Let candid men judge, then, whether the division of America into any given number of independent sovereignties would tend to secure us against the hostilities and improper interference of foreign nations. And so ends Federalist 5. And this is the argument for the mutual defense and aid of, right? Any undermining of our interest as a whole makes us individually weaker. And we see that. We do. We see that playing out now with the communists. Now, a lot of people will take exception to that, but I don't really care because I don't like communism. It's a horrible ideology. And we see it being enacted today. That is how they are undermining us. It's not some foreign country coming here. It is our children they are using. But they are undermining us every bit as much as we are being warned about here. This isn't some foreign actor coming in and saying, you change to us. This is them coming into your children and convincing your children to go with them. And that is terrible. Federalist paper number 6. This is for the Independent Journal and is written by Alexander Hamilton. To the people of the state of New York. The last 3 numbers of this paper have been dedicated to an enumeration of the dangers to which we should be exposed in a state of disunion from the arms and arts of foreign nations. I shall now proceed to delineate dangers of a different and perhaps still more alarming kind, those which will in all probability flow from dissensions between the states themselves and from domestic factions and convulsions. These have already been in some instances highly anticipated, but they deserve a more particular and more full investigation. A man must be far gone in utopian speculations who can seriously doubt that if these states should either be wholly disunited or only united in partial confederacies. Sorry, I have to be right back. I gotta let this dog out. So. Unmute. Get rid of that. All right. Nothing like puppet pain. A man must be far gone in utopian speculations who can seriously doubt that if these states should either be wholly disunited or only united in partial confederacies, the subdivisions into which they might be thrown would have frequent and violent contests with each other. To presume a want of motives for such contests as an argument against their existence would be to forget that men are ambitious, vindictive, and rapacious. To look for a continuation of harmony between a number of independent, unconnected sovereignties in the same neighborhood would be to disregard the uniform course of human events and to set at defiance the accumulated experience of ages. The causes of hostility among nations are innumerable. There are some which have a general and almost constant operation on the collective body of society. Of this description are the love of power, or the desire of preeminence and dominion, the jealousy of power, or the desire of equality and safety. There are others which have a more circumscribed though an equally operative influence within their spheres. Such are the rivalships and competitions of commerce between commercial nations, and there are others, not less numerous than either of the former, which take their origin entirely in private passions, in the attachments, enmities, interests, hopes, and fears of leading individuals in the communities of which they are members. Men of this class, whether the favorites of a king or of a people, have, in too many instances, abused the confidence they possessed, and, assuming the pretext of some public motive, have not scrupled to sacrifice the national tranquility to personal advantage or personal gratification. The celebrated Pericles, in compliance with the resentment of a prostitute, at the expense of much of the blood and treasure of his countrymen, attacked, vanquished, and destroyed the city of the Samnians. The same man, stimulated by private pique against the Margentians, another nation of Greece, or to avoid a prosecution to which he was threatened as an accomplice of a supposed theft of the statuary Phidias, or to get rid of the accusations prepared to be brought against him for dissipating the funds of the state in the purchase of popularity, or from a combination of all these causes, was the primitive author of that famous and fatal war, distinguished in the Grecian annals by the name of the Peloponnesian War, which, after various vicissitudes, intermissions, and renewals, terminated in the ruin of the Athenian Commonwealth. The ambitious cardinal, who was prime minister to Henry VIII, permitting his vanity to aspire to the triple crown, entertained hopes of succeeding in the acquisition of that splendid prize by the influence of the Emperor Charles V. To secure the favor and interest of this enterprising and powerful monarch, he precipitated England into a war with France, contrary to the plainest dictates of policy, and at the hazard of the safety and independence, as well as the kingdom over which he presided by his counsels, as of Europe in general. For if there ever was a sovereign who bid fair to realize the project of universal monarchy, it was the Emperor Charles V, of whose intrigues Wolsey was at once the instrument and the dupe. The influence by which the bigotry of one female, the petulance of another, and the cabals of a third had in the contemporary policy, ferments, and pacifications of a considerable part of Europe are topics that have too often descanted not to be generally known. To multiply examples of the agency of personal considerations in the production of great national events, either foreign or domestic, according to their direction, would be an unnecessary waste of time. Those who have but a superficial acquaintance with the sources from which they are to be drawn will themselves recollect a variety of instances, and those who have a tolerable knowledge of human nature will not stand in need of such lights to form their opinions either of the reality or the extent of that agency. Perhaps, however, a reference tending to illustrate the general principle may with propriety be made to a case which has lately happened among ourselves. If Shays had not been a desperate debtor, it is much to be doubted whether Massachusetts would have been plunged into civil war. But, notwithstanding the concurring testimony of experience, in this particular, there are still to be found visionary or designing men who stand ready to advocate the paradox of perpetual peace between the states, though dismembered and alienated from each other. The genius of republics, say they, is pacific. The spirit of commerce has a tendency to soften the manners of men and to extinguish those inflammable humors which have so often kindled into wars. Commercial republics like ours will never be disposed to waste themselves in ruinous contentions with each other. They will be governed by mutual interest and will cultivate a spirit of mutual amity and concord. Is it not, we may ask these projectors in politics, the true interest of all nations to cultivate the same benevolent, and philosophic spirit? If this be their true interest, have they in fact pursued it? Has it not, on the contrary, invariably been found that momentary passions and immediate interest have a more active and imperious control over human conduct than general or remote considerations of policy, utility, or justice? Have republics, in practice, been less addicted to war than monarchies? Are not the former administered by men as well as the latter? Are there not aversions, predilections, rivalships, and desires of unjust acquisitions that affect nations as well as kings? Are not popular assemblies frequently subject to the impulses of rage, resentment, jealousy, avarice, and of other irregular and violent propensities? Is it not well known that their determinations are often governed by a few individuals in whom they place confidence, and are, of course, liable to be tinctured by the passions and views of those individuals? Has commerce hitherto done anything more than change the object of war? Is it not is not the love of wealth as domineering and enterprising a passion as that of power or glory? Have there not been as many wars founded upon commercial motives, since that has become the prevailing system of nations, as there were before, occasioned by the cupidity of territory or dominion? Has not the spirit of commerce, in many instances, administered new incentives to the appetite, both for the one and for the other? Let experience, the least fallible guide of human opinions, be appealed to for an answer to these inquiries. Sparta, Athens, Rome, and Carthage were all republics, two of them, Athens and Carthage, of the commercial kind. Yet were they as often engaged in wars, offensive and defensive, as the neighboring monarchies at the same times? Sparta was little better than a well regulated camp, and Rome was never sated of carnage and conquest. Carthage, though a commercial republic, was the aggressor in the very war that ended in her destruction. Hannibal had carried her arms into the heart of Italy and to the gates of Rome before Scipio, in turn, gave him an overthrow into the territories of Carthage and made a conquest of the Commonwealth. Venice, in later times, figured more than once in wars of ambition, till, becoming an object to the other Italian states, Pope Julius II found means to accomplish that formidable league, which gave a deadly blow to the power and pride of this haughty republic. The provinces of Holland, till they were overwhelmed in debt and taxes, took a leading and conspicuous part in the wars of Europe. They had furious contests with England for the dominion of the sea, and were among the most persevering and most implacable of the opponents of Louis XIV. In the government of Britain, the representatives of the people compose one branch of the national legislature. Commerce has been for ages the predominant pursuit of that country. Few nations, nevertheless, have been more frequently engaged in war, and the wars in which that kingdom has been engaged have, in numerous instances, proceeded from the people. There have been, if I may so express it, almost as many popular as royal wars. The cries of the nation and the importunities of their representatives have, upon various occasions, dragged their monarchs into war, or continued them in it, contrary to their inclinations, and sometimes contrary to the real interest of the state. In that memorable struggle for superiority between the rival houses of Austria and Bourbon, which so long kept Europe in a flame, it is well known that the antipathies of the English against the French, seconding the ambition, or rather the avarice, of a favorite leader, protracted the war beyond the limits marked out by sound policy, and for a considerable time in opposition to the views of the court. The wars of these last two mentioned nations have, in great measure, grown out of commercial considerations. And the desire of supplanting and the fear of being supplanted, either in particular branches of traffic or in the general advantages of trade and navigation. From this summary of what has taken place in other countries whose situations have borne the nearest resemblance of our own, what reason can we have to confide in those reveries which would seduce us into an expectation of peace and cordiality between the members of the present Confederacy in a state of separation? Have we not already seen enough of the fallacy and extravagance of these idle theories which have amused us with promises of an exemption from the imperfections, weaknesses, and evils incident to society in every shape? Is it not time to awake from the deceitful dream of a golden age and to adopt as a practical maxim for the direction of our political conduct that we, as well as other inhabitants of the globe, are yet remote from the happy empire of perfect wisdom and perfect virtue? Let the point of extreme depression to which our national dignity and credit have sunk, let the inconveniences felt everywhere from a lax and ill administration of government, let the revolt of a part of the state of North Carolina, the late menacing disturbances in Pennsylvania, and the actual insurrections and rebellions in Massachusetts declare. So far is the general sense of mankind from corresponding with the tenets of those who endeavor to lull asleep our apprehensions of discord and hostility between the states, in the event of disunion, that it has, from long observation of the progress of society, become a sort of axiom in politics that vicinity or nearness of situations constitutes nations' natural enemies. An intelligent writer expresses himself on this subject to this effect. Neighboring nations, says he, are naturally enemies of each other, unless their common weaknesses forces them to league into a confederate republic, and their constitution prevents the differences that neighborhoods occasions, extinguishing that secret jealousy which disposes all states to aggrandize themselves at the expense of their neighbors. This passage, at the same time, points out the evil and suggests the remedy. Well, if that's not a lesson for today, I don't know what is, right? We have extreme disunion. We have the leadership in several states talking about the leadership in several other states, and that's not even calling sides, right? Both sides are doing it. Both sides is a very loose term for me. The uniparty is a very real thing, right? We're not dealing with Republicans and Democrats. We're dealing with the uniparty and free thinkers. And that is the two sides. I fall on the side of the free thinkers. I want to believe that I have the best interest of the nation at heart, even though I don't agree with things that they do in California and the things that they do in Colorado or New York or Illinois. I don't agree with them at all. But I live in Louisiana and we're not supposed to have to agree with everything. That's the point of having a republic. It is 50 independent states acting together in concert with our national dignity at stake, with our national purpose at stake, with our growth and our health and our welfare and our entirety of our life is at stake. We have to be able to compromise with our republic. We are falling prey to outside influences in the war spectrum. We have gone past just wars, and we have gone past wars with reason, if ever there is a reason for war. Then we are now into the wars of deception and the wars of political expedience that are warmed up in this very letter. This is the letters to convince us to become a union, and it is warning us about the things that have fallen upon our union, and we should be paying attention to that. Federalist number 7. For the Independent Journal from Alexander Hamilton to the people of the state of New York. Concerning dangers from dissension between the states. Is it sometimes asked with an air of, it is sometimes asked with an air of seeming triumph. What inducements could the states have, if disunited, to make war upon each other? It would be a full answer to this question to say precisely the same inducements which have, at different times, deluged in blood all the nations in the world. But, unfortunately for us, the question admits of a more particular answer. There are causes of differences within our immediate contemplation, with the tendency of which, even under the restraints of a federal constitution, we have had sufficient experience to enable us to form a judgment of what might be expected if those restraints were removed. Territorial disputes have at all times been found in one of the most fertile sources of hostility among nations. Perhaps the greatest proportion of wars that have desolated the earth have sprung from this origin. This cause would exist among us in full force. We have a vast tract of unsettled territory within the boundaries of the United States. There are still discordant and undecided claims between several of them, and the dissolution of the Union would lay a foundation for similar claims between them all. It is well known that they have heretofore had serious and animated discussion concerning the rights to the lands which were ungranted at the time of the Revolution, and which usually went under the name of Crown lands. The states within the limits of those whose colonial governments were compromised have claimed them as their property. The others have contended that the rights of the Crown in this article devolved upon the Union, especially as to all that part of the Western territory which, either by actual possession or through the submission of the Indian proprietors, was subjected to the jurisdiction of the King of Great Britain, till it was relinquished in the Treaty of Peace. This, it has been said, was at all events an acquisition to the Confederacy by compact with a foreign power. It has been the prudent policy of Congress to appease this controversy by prevailing upon the states to make cessations to the United States for the benefit of the whole. This has been so far accomplished as, under the continuation of the Union, to afford a decided prospect of an amicable termination of the dispute. A dismemberment of the Confederacy, however, would revive this dispute, and would create others on the same subject. At present, a large part of the vacant Western territory is, by cessation at least, if not by any interior right, the common property of the Union. If that were an end, the states which made the cessation on a principle of federal compromise would be apt, when the motive of the grant had ceased, to reclaim the lands as a reversion. The other states would no doubt insist on a proportion by right of representation. Their argument would be that a grant, once made, could not be revoked, and that the justice of participating in territory acquired by or secured by the joint efforts of the Confederacy remain undiminished. If, contrary to probability, it should be admitted by all the states that each had a right to share of this common stock, there would still be a difficulty to be surmounted. As to a proper rule of apportionment, different principles would be set up by different states for this purpose, and as they would affect the opposite interest of the parties, they might not as easily be susceptible to a pacific adjustment. In the wide field of Western territory, therefore, we perceive an ample theater for hostile pretensions, without any umpire or common judge to interpose between the contending parties. To reason from the past to the future, we shall have good ground to apprehend that the sword would sometimes be appealed to as the arbiter of their differences. The circumstances of the dispute between Connecticut and Pennsylvania, respecting the land at Wyoming, admonish us not to be sanguine in expecting an easy accommodation of such differences. The Articles of Confederation obliged the parties to submit the matter to the decision of a federal court. The submission was made, and the court decided in favor of Pennsylvania. But Connecticut gave strong indications of dissatisfaction with that determination, nor did she appear to be entirely resigned to it, till, by negotiation and management, something like an equivalent was found for the loss she supposed herself to have sustained. Nothing here is said. Nothing here said is intended to convey the slightest censure on the conduct of that state. She no doubt sincerely believed herself to have been injured by the decision, and states, like individuals, acquiesced with great reluctance and determinations to their disadvantage. Those who had an opportunity of seeing inside the transactions which attended the progress of the controversy between the state and the District of Vermont can vouch the opposition we experienced, as well from states not interested as from those which were interested in the claim, and can attest to the danger to which the peace of the Confederacy might have been exposed. Had this state attempted to assert its rights by force, two motives preponderated in that opposition. One, a jealousy entertained of our future power, and the other, the interest of certain individuals of influence in the neighboring states who had obtained grants of lands under the actual government of that district. Even the states which brought forward claims in contradiction to ours seemed more solicitous to dismember this state than to establish their own pretensions. These were New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. New Jersey and Rhode Island, upon all occasions, discovered a warm zeal for the independence of Vermont, and Maryland, still alarmed by the appearance of a connection between Canada and that state, entered deeply into the same views. These, being small states, saw with an unfriendly eye the perspective of our growing greatness. In a review of these transactions, we may trace some of the causes which would be likely to embroil the states with each other, if it should be their unpropitious destiny to become disunited. The competitions of commerce would be another fruitful source of contention. The states less favorably circumstanced would be desirous of escaping from the disadvantages of local situation and of sharing in the advantages of their more advantageous neighbors. Each state or separate confederacy would pursue a system of commercial policy peculiar to itself. This would occasion distinctions, preferences, and exclusions, which would beget discontent. The habits of intercourse, on the basis of equal privileges, to which we have been accustomed since the earliest settlement of the country, would give a keener edge to those causes of discontent than they would naturally have independent of this circumstance. We should be ready to denominate injuries those things which were in reality the justifiable acts of independent sovereignties, consulting a direct interest. The spirit of enterprise, which characterizes the commercial part of America, has left no occasion of displaying itself unimproved. It is not at all probable that this unbridled spirit would pay much respect to those regulations of trade by which particular states might endeavor to secure exclusive benefits to their own citizens. These infractions of these regulations on one side, the efforts to prevent and repel them on the other, would naturally lead to outrages, and these to reprisals and wars. The opportunities which some states would have of rendering others tributary to them by commercial regulations would be impatiently submitted to the tributary states. The relative situation of New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey would afford an example of this kind. New York, from the necessities of revenue, must lay duties on her importations. A great part of these duties must be paid by the inhabitants of the two other states in the capacity of consumers of what we import. New York would neither be willing nor able to forego this advantage. Her citizens would not consent that a duty paid by them should be remitted in favor of the citizens of her neighbors, nor would it be practical, if there were not this impediment in the way, to distinguish the customers in their own markets. Would Connecticut and New Jersey long submit to be taxed by New York for her exclusive benefit? Should we be long permitted to remain in the quiet and undisturbed enjoyment of a metropolis, from the possession of which we derived an advantage so odious to our neighbors, and in their opinion, so oppressive? Should we be able to preserve it against the incumbent weight of Connecticut on the one side and the cooperating pressure of New Jersey on the other? There are questions that temerity alone will answer in the affirmative. The public debt of the Union would be further cause of collision between separate states or confederacies. The apportionment in the first instance and the progressive extinguishment afterward would be alike productive of ill humor and animosity. How would it be possible to agree upon a rule of apportionment satisfactory to all? There is scarcely any that can be proposed which is entirely free from real objections. These, as usual, would be exaggerated by the adverse interest of some of the parties. There are even dissimilar views among the states as to the general principle of discharging the public debt. Some of them, either less impressed with the importance of national credit, or because their citizens have little, if any, immediate interest in the question, feel an indifference, if not a repugnance, to the payment of the domestic debt at any rate. These would be inclined to magnify the difficulties of a distribution. Others of them, a numerous body of whose citizens are creditors to the public beyond proportion of the state in the total amount of the national debt, would be strenuous for some equitable and effective provision. The procrastinations of the former would excite the resentments of the latter. The settlement of a rule would, in the meantime, be postponed by real differences of opinion and affected delays. The citizens of the states interested would clamor. Foreign powers would urge for the satisfaction of their just demands, and the peace of the states would be hazarded to the double contingency of external invasion and internal contention. Suppose the difficulties of agreeing upon a rule surmounted and the apportionment made, still there is great room to suppose that the rule agreed upon would, upon experiment, be found to bear harder upon some states than upon others. Those which were sufferers by it would naturally seek for a mitigation of the burden. The others would be as naturally be disinclined to a revision, which was likely to end in an increase in their own encumbrances. Their refusal would be too plausible a pretext to the complaining states to withhold their contributions, not to be embraced with avidity. And the non-compliance of these states with their engagements would be a ground of bitter discussion and altercation. If even the rule adopted should in practice justify the equality of its principle, still delinquencies in payments on the part of the states would result from a diversity of other causes. The real deficiency of resources, the mismanagement of their finances, accidental disorders in the management of the government, and, in addition to the rest, the reluctance with which men commonly part with money for purposes that have outlived their exigencies which produce them, and interfere with the supply of immediate wants. Delinquencies, from whatever causes, would be productive of complaints, recriminations, and quarrels. There is, perhaps, nothing more likely to disturb the tranquility of nations than their being bound by mutual contributions for any common object that does not yield an equal and coincident benefit. For it is an observation, as true as it is trite, that there is nothing men differ so readily about as the payment of money. Laws in violation of private contracts, as they amount to aggressions on the rights of those states whose citizens are injured by them, would be considered as another probable source of hostility. We are not authorized to expect that a more liberal or more equitable spirit would preside over the legislations of the individual states hereafter, if unrestrained by any additional checks than we have heretofore seen in too many instances disgracing their several codes. We have observed the disposition to retaliation excited in Connecticut in consequence of the enormities perpetrated by the legislature of Rhode Island, and we reasonably infer that in similar cases, under other circumstances, a war, not of parchment, but of the sword, would chastise such atrocious breaches of moral obligation and social justice. The probability of incompatible alliances between the states or confederacies and different foreign nations, and the effects of this situation upon the peace of the whole, have been sufficiently unfolded in some preceding papers. From the view they have exhibited of this part of the subject, this conclusion is to be drawn: that America, if not connected at all, or only by the feeble tie of a simple league, offensive and defensive, would, by the operation of such jarring alliances, be gradually entangled in all the pernicious labyrinths of European politics and wars, and by the destructive contentions of the parts into which she was divided, would be likely to become prey to the artifices and machinations of powers equally the enemies of them all. Divide et impera must be the motto of every nation that either hates or fears us. And so we have here a good argument for the compact between the states for the peaceful and amicable resolve of any disputes. I'm going to take a short break right here. We will be back in just a minute. I'm going to go check on my dog and all of that and get some water because this is rough. See you in just a minute. Unmute. And we are back. I see somebody here. Can you hear me? Let me know in the comments, please. Uh, I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to get through 8 through 10 today, and I think that we may wind up going ahead and wrapping this one up if we're not getting comments, because I'm going to continue with this tomorrow, and we got 3 more to get through in this introductory session, and I'm not sure my voice will hold out for another 45 minutes or so. This has been great that I've been able to do this this long. So there is that. Well, hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a somewhat difficult series of topics. This is the argument for our union. This is the reason why we actually wound up with a ratified constitution in the United States. And it is important that we review these things, that we do it out loud. Part of that is an energetic investment. And I know that's too woo-woo for some people, but I believe that the things that you focus your attention on are the things that get resolved. They get the end brought to them. And so if we are investing our energy into the foundational principles of this country and to reiterate the need for our union, the reasons why we even have one, if we can speak those aloud, the more people that speak them aloud, the more energy is invested into the actual principles that we hold, the freedom that we seek, the equality between people, not equity, but equality. These things are all important. And all of them are laid out in extreme detail in these letters. It is important from time to time to go back and review, to understand why you hold the beliefs that you do. This is good for me because I never read through the Federalist Papers. Hopefully this is good for you because it's giving you a chance to listen to them as opposed to having to sit down and read them yourself. That's the point of this, right? This is the energetic investment, and for you to have a resource available to you that's not anywhere else. So hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to it. I fully hold with most of what we've read so far, right? We do indeed have more strength together, but we are not supposed to be one homogenous nation. We're supposed to be 50 independent states that act together in concert for the benefit of all. And that is not nearly what we have now, but it is the goal. It is what we are striving for. The achievement of that is indeed making America great again. And that is the purpose. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete just the way that you are. And this has been Pitt State. Peace.